What's good? It's Woog. Jamel Herring just retained his WBO 130-pound title versus Carl Frampton. He TKO'd him in the 6th round, dropped him once in the 5th, dropped him again in the 6th, and then there was a flurry of well-connected punches that caused the corner of Carl Frampton to throw in the towel. So, technical knockout. The stakes were high here, and not just because it was a title fight, but it was a fight between two guys in their mid-30s, one whose legacy is more or less already established, having been a multiple division world title holder. Carl Frampton had his most dominating days back at 122, and then had his biggest fights, like the two against Leo Santa Cruz at 126, and here he is at 130 trying to capture a belt in a 3rd weight class. Jamel Herring is a little more of a late bloomer, and he captured a WBO belt, which I've long held is the least credible of the 4 major belts. Usually the best in the division is going to be holding either the WBC title or the WBA title. Then there's the IBF, which, I mean, sometimes there are exceptions. Errol Spence captured his first belt, and it was the IBF belt versus Kell Brook. Terrence Crawford is currently the WBO belt holder at 147, but that's the exception. But in Jamel Herring's last fight, a title defense versus Jonathan Oquendo, he had suffered a cut in the fight that he's been criticized so heavily over his body language and over his seeming unwillingness to want to continue with the fight. Like, he insisted that the fight was stopped, and I'm always leery to kind of go there in terms of, testing somebody's fortitude. Like, every now and then you'll get the very obvious case where, Victor Ortiz said after he was upset by Marcos Maidana when nobody knew about Maidana. Listen to Victor Ortiz's post-fight interview following him basically telling the ref, no, I don't want to continue, when the ref is like basically counting him and saying, do you want to continue? Do you want to continue? Well, Victor Ortiz said after the fight, yeah, I'm going to have to rethink this whole fighting thing, basically. And he did go on to have several more fights in his career, but it was a real gut check, and it wasn't his bravest moment in the ring. So Jamel Herring had a situation where it seemed like he could have advocated for the fight to continue. He clearly didn't. And, people much more qualified to speak on this stuff than myself, I'm talking Andre Ward, Timothy Bradley, were highly critical of Jamel Herring's handling of that situation. So he had a lot on his plate coming in, just reputation-wise. I mean, people were basically, kind of testing his manhood. And this is somebody who, it's well documented. He's a former Marine who did tours in the Middle East. And, he's had a lot of, personal tragedy. He's really one of these figures who you ideally would pull for as a fight fan or just as a life fan, right? So there was a lot on the line here. And for Jamel Herring to deliver in the way that he did versus the highest profile name that he's fought, and maybe this was a perfect scenario where you had a much smaller fighter who was also long in the tooth coming up, basically fighting 2 weight classes too high, in my opinion. Maybe 1 weight class too high. Actually, 1 weight class too high. He had solidified himself at 126. Former champ there, and if you split with Leo Santa Cruz, yeah, you're a 126 guy. Even if you had your best days, your most dominant days at 122. So this was a fight where it was almost, 50-50 odds-wise. I heard a lot of experts picking, Carl Frampton here. I believe Mike Coppinger at The Athletic picked Carl Frampton. They just thought that he was the more gifted boxer, the more skilled out of the two, had the faster hands probably. But, when you look at Carl Frampton's career and you look at the guys who he beat at 122, then at 126, yes, some of the guys were taller than him. Like Santa Cruz was taller than him. Frampton's like 5'5". Santa Cruz is probably 5'7", 5'8". And then Frampton had 2 fights with Kiko Martinez, who's also 5'5". Scott Quigg is a little taller. Frampton had a good fight with him. But Jamel Herring was first of all, I believe this was only Frampton's second fight in the division. The first fight was against somebody who, it was during COVID, somebody who was totally outmatched, was his first fight at 130. So the second one is against Jamel Herring, who's a big 130, easily could be a 135 fighter. I don't know how good he would be at 135, but just body-wise, it looks like that would even be probably a more natural fit because he's so tall. So you had Frampton, who, you know, at his best, you know, I remember the way that he would drop his left hand and just kind of like leave it hanging there. And, you know, and only the athletic fighters could do that. You know, Roy Jones Jr. did that. You know, certain fighters, you'll see they have the confidence in their reflexes and their speed to where they'll leave their lead hand down because they're not worried about you. They feel like they could counter you quicker than you could get off. They just feel like they've got it under control to the point where they can do that type of thing. That was Frampton. And I always wondered, what's going to happen when he fights, you know, some, you know, other, you know, really athletic fighters, but bigger fighters. You know, Nonito Donaire is obviously a very gifted puncher. He, pound for pound, once upon a time, he was one of the best and flashiest Filipino flash puncher in the game. But he was, you know, a little post-prime by the time he fought Frampton. But my cousin, Benji, was basically saying, man, I should have bet on this game, or bet on this fight. And it was because, and I haven't followed up with him on all of the reasons why, but I'd imagine that it's because on paper you just see person A and person B, and if you didn't know anything about their fight history, didn't know that one was like a two-time champ, you just say both of these guys, you know, they like to fight and they're as good as they can possibly be. They're about the same age, both in the, you know, in their mid-30s, although we know that Frampton is more experienced in the ring, also meaning has a lot more ring wear from all of the lumps he's taken in the ring. And keep in mind, he's only lost like a couple fights in his entire career. It was to Leo Santa Cruz in their rematch. Then it was to Josh Warrington, and that's where he really got knocked off his kind of 126-pound pedestal. Josh Warrington has since been upset by Mauricio Lara just a couple months ago. That was another shocker. Well, shocker to some. But, you know, a lot of people aren't buying some of the elevated UK fighters if they haven't had a lot of experience on this side of the pond. And I'm sure the same applies, you know, when they hear about an American fighter coming over there. They're probably thinking, well, you know, how are they going to stack up against, you know, the best of our fleet? You know what I mean? And, you know, to his credit, Carl Frampton did fight Leo Santa Cruz twice, did fight Nonito Donaire, did fight these established, across the board, undeniable talents. But when you see, you know, Josh Warrington beating Lee Selby and then beating Carl Frampton and then losing to Mauricio Lara, you know, a lot of people fairly or unfairly are going to say, well, you know, how good was Lee Selby? You know what I mean? And that those conversations are other conversations in themselves. I thought that Lee Selby actually should have gotten the decision win versus George Kambosos, who's going to be Teofimo Lopez's next mandatory challenger. I thought that should have been Lee Selby. Close fight, but they gave the decision to Kambosos. I thought Lee Selby pulled it off. But you always have these questions that'll forever, in most cases, remain unanswered, because at the end of the day, we usually don't end up seeing everybody that we want to see fight each other actually fight each other. So Jamel Herring pretty much controlled the fight. He won. I had him winning the first 3 rounds of the fight. I had Frampton mounting a rally in the 4th round and really kind of, you know, closed the distance and made it a phone booth style fight. That's around the time that, you know, Jamel Herring suffered another cut. I mean, is this a little like poetic justice? Could the circumstances have lined up any more fitting for the storybook ending to this little part of the saga? Jamel Herring gets cut, and everybody wants to see what's going to happen next. Bradley, Andre Ward, Tessitore, they're like, let's see how Herring responds to this situation that he's confronted with. But, you know, he never truly lost control of this fight here. Carl Frampton, again, mounted a little rally in the 4th, was able to close the distance, was able to connect cleanly a few times with some nice shots against Herring. But for the most part, Herring's jab was just winning out. And then he sat down on a straight left hand. And this was like from long range and just put Frampton Frampton on his butt. It was, the first 3 rounds, Frampton was trying to figure out ways to get in. It was kind of getting controlled distance-wise. But after he closed the distance in the 4th round, well, in the 5th round, again, it was that left hand, and it just kind of came out of nowhere. It was almost like Frampton wasn't aware that, the ref had said fight, like that the fight was on, but it was just boom, boom. Almost like the right hand that Lennox Lewis knocked Hasim Rahman out with. Different in a lot of ways, and it was a different hand that he threw, but similar, just long range, where it's like, damn, you mean you could have just done this whole time and you just pulled the trigger on it now? But Frampton was really hurt by that shot. He was sat down on his butt with the shot. It wasn't like on his back. He was seated, and sometimes when the guy's knocked down like that, they're really hurt. Other times they're not that badly hurt. Frampton, I feel like his legs were compromised pretty badly from that point forward, and then in the next round, he got lit up with a uppercut that he just did not see, and it got all of them to where you see the neck turn, and that one put him on his back, and he almost had a delayed reaction, because he crouched down into the uppercut, got hit by it, was kind of folded over but still standing, and then slowly crumpled backwards and fell onto his his shoulders, basically on his upper back where his legs kick up in the air. He was in trouble. He was in trouble, and the fight was stopped shortly after that. So, he said coming in that if he lost this fight, he was going to retire. He's probably a Hall of Famer. I'd have to look a little closer at the resume. He's a 2-division champion. He's not necessarily, I'd have to go back on this, I don't think he's a 2-division unified champ, meaning holding 2 or more of the belts, which, again, like if he won a belt here, it's the WBO belt. It doesn't make you the king of that division. There are 4 major titles, and the WBO is usually, again, there are exceptions, but it's usually the least consequential. So it's a little bit misleading when somebody says 4-division champion, 6-division champion, 3-division, in this modern era where there's 1, more weight classes, and 2, 4 belts, 4 major belts in that division instead of 2 or 3, which was the case in past eras. So not all champions are equal. With that said, Jamel Herring retains his WBO title. So what's next at 130? Well, Jamel Herring might go up to 135 because his mandatory is Shakur Stevenson. And Shakur Stevenson felt that they kind of, had an understanding, or at least it was Shakur Stevenson's understanding, that if Herring defended successfully, that he would then go up, drop his belt, and then go up and, give it a go at 135. Basically abandon his title, and then Shakur Stevenson would be fighting for the vacant title. Now, there's a chance that could happen. They're friends, Shakur Stevenson and Jamel Herring. Jamel Herring, again, is about 34, 35. Shakur Stevenson appears to have his whole career ahead of him. He's like 22 years old. So they're friends, but they're not like contemporaries. We're talking, 36 years old, Jamel Herring, or 35, something like that. Let's call it 35. He's about 13 years older than Shakur Stevenson. I think Herring wants to fight Oscar Valdez, the current WBC title holder, who just upset and shocked Miguel Berchelt with that vicious knockout about a month ago. And if Oscar Valdez agrees to fight there, well, then you've got a nice unification match right there between Oscar Valdez and Jamel Herring. Another belt holder, by the way, is the WBA champ, Gervonta Davis, who's on another platform, PBC, so it's kind of hard to picture cross-promotional fights to unify these titles at this point, so I'm not even factoring him into this particular picture, although he does compete and hold the WBA super title at 130 currently, after beating Leo Santa Cruz with the vicious uppercut. But if Valdez Herring gets made, great. Unification fight at 130, 2 belts on the line. Or what might happen, because Valdez, Shakur Stevenson doesn't appear to be happening next. Keep in mind, Shakur Stevenson might be the name that's ringing in the division, but he currently doesn't have a title. In fact, he did have a title at the lower weight class, 126, and that belt that he picked up in a vacant title bout against Joey Gonzalez was actually the same belt that Oscar Valdez had vacated at 126. So Valdez, the current 130 WBC title holder, was a title holder at 126, vacated that title to go up to 130, And then Shakur Stevenson would later fight for that vacant 126 title against Joey Gonzalez, and he won that. So at 130, one division up, Shakur Stevenson, again, is a name that's ringing, but he's not holding a belt. So he's the mandatory challenger for Oscar Valdez's title and for Jamel Herring's title. So he's the WBC mandatory and the WBO mandatory. Valdez, I don't think is going to fight immediately, which is why they've booked Stevenson versus Nakathila, not Nakatani, the Japanese guy at 135 who just knocked out Felix Verdejo and gave Teofimo Lopez a run for his money and is going to maybe be fighting Lomachenko. That'd be great. But I'm talking Nakathila, Shakur Stevenson's next opponent in June. I think that Jamel Herring will try to get the fight with Valdez. If that doesn't work out, he'll go up to 135 instead of defending his WBO belt against Shakur Stevenson. And then by that time, they're going to elevate that Shakur Stevenson-Nakathila upcoming fight to becoming a fight for the vacant WBO title, since Jamel Herring would have had to then vacated the WBO belt. So Shakur Stevenson, Nakathila might be for a vacant WBO title. So that's how I see the picture of 130 developing. But let me know what you think about Herring versus Frampton. By the way, I thought it was pretty whack that they allowed Frampton to enter the ring after the champion Herring. The disrespect. You know, I saw them do that with the Callum Smith versus Canelo fight too. Callum Smith, the champion at the time, you know, the WBA belt holder at 168, entered the ring before the challenger in that case, Canelo Alvarez. They did the same BS thing here, the disrespect. But yeah, let me know what you think about that fight. What do you think about the 130-pound division? Also, do you think that Carl Frampton is a Hall of Famer? I think that he might, because of his work, you know, obviously being as good as he was at 122, where he seemed, you know, pretty dominant. He didn't, like, you know, unify all the belts or anything, but he was, like, looking great and beating high-profile fighters, really good fighters at 122, including Scott Quigg, who was a major dude at the time. And then, obviously, his two classics versus Leo Santa Cruz, which you kind of wish that they had a third fight. It just seems fitting, right? Maybe they still could. Maybe that's the last fight of both of their careers. Maybe that is a perfect fight to make if there is one more, if they don't truly walk away from the sport. You know, I don't know how the business will work out, being that Leo Santa Cruz is still with PBC and Carl Frampton isn't. But yeah, let me know what you think about all that. Please leave your comments in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.